Hello and welcome. If you haven't already, I invite you to please click subscribe. There's no obligation, and it allows you to be notified of all new chapters. Additional information about the story, including the author, chapter warnings, and rating, can be found in the description below. All credit goes to the original author. All That Remains by Orphan Account, Chapter 13, The Battle of the Five Armies. Third Age, 2941, 70 years ago. Legolas could not believe it. Out of all things, elves, men, and dwarves were going to war over gems, gold, and precious stones. When he had heard of the dragon Smaug's death, the assassin had been happy for the dwarves that had succeeded in reclaiming their home. He had thought their troubles were over, and that their quest had been completed without any more misadventures and problems. Then he had heard that the men of Lake Town and the elves of Mirkwood wanted a piece of Erebur's great treasure, and Thorin was unwilling to part with any of it. So now the elves and men were laying siege on Erebur, where the dwarves' army had massed to defend their hoard. The assassin really wanted to knock more than a few heads together. Stupid, stubborn, idiotic people. He found that he could not side with anyone, or leave anyone blameless. Thorin was being stubborn, greedy, and pig-headed, refusing to even consider giving gold to anyone. Yes, he had just reclaimed it, but much of it belonged to others, having been hoarded by his grandfather and Smaug. The men of Lake Town deserved credit and compensation for killing the dragon after it destroyed most of their town. Legolas had a feeling Bilbo antagonized it. He should have a talk with the hobbit later about not mocking dragons. But they should be relying on diplomacy to get what they want. And that was coming from an assassin whose gentlest and most tactful diplomatic techniques consisted of knocking people unconscious. Finally, Thranduil sought compensation for Thorin's slights to him and his people. Still, to go to war for gold, the elf found he just could not understand it. Did gold matter so much that people were willing to die for it? Was there not enough bloodshed and deaths from Smaug's attacks? Apparently not, because these people were willing to die and kill for metal and jewels. At these thoughts, Legolas, who grew up surrounded by battles and bitter strife, found himself angry at all parties in the siege that would soon become war. How could they fight and bicker over something so stupid? But he could do nothing. The assassin was currently hiding near the elf and men encampment. The two races had joined to make their own war against the dwarves. Legolas shook his head, scowling darkly with his eyes glittering. He did not like the situation. Not at all. A presence caught his attention, and he smiled. He spotted Bilbo near the edge of the encampment, sneaking towards it with a nervous look on his face. His hands were clasped to his coat, as if he were holding something there. Legolas crept up behind him, whispering in his ear, "Bilbo." The hobbit jumped a foot in the air, but did not shriek. He spun, wide-eyed. "Eskel," he hissed, "please stop doing that." "Sorry," the assassin said. "Why are you sneaking about?" The hobbit reached in his coat, revealing a large, shimmering gem, the Arkenstone. "I'm taking it to the Elven King. Maybe it will be enough to stop the elves and men from fighting the dwarves, or he can use it to make Thorin give some of the gold up." "Why aren't you siding with Thorin?" Legolas asked, curiously. "Thorin's almost mad with greed," Bilbo said miserably. "He wants to keep all the gold and jewels. But Eskel, there's so much of it, much more than he needs. I tried to explain that to him, but he cast me out and declared me a traitor. It is almost like he is a different person." "I will never understand how jewels and gold can be so valuable," the assassin said slowly. but wealth like that can change people, and rarely for the better. Hopefully Thorin realizes that all of the gold in Middle-earth is not worth the lives of him and his kin. Hopefully, Bilbo echoed him, voice lacking the hope he had just spoken of. Seeing his friend's discomfort, Legolas changed the subject. How did you find the Arkenstone? I stumbled upon it when I snuck into Smaug's lair, Bilbo said, glancing down at the glowing heart of the mountain. The assassin raised his eyebrows. You wouldn't have happened to insult or mock Smaug while you were there? The hobbit winced, looking guilty. I may have claimed we had a way to destroy him, which we did. After Lake Town was burned to the ground. Legolas's voice was not accusing, only gently scolding the hobbit. While things turned out right in the end and Smaug was killed, your words caused great damage, Bilbo. I know, the hobbit said heavily. That's why I'm going to give part of my share of the gold to Lake Town. If I ever get my payment, that is. The elf hummed vaguely. His violet eyes narrowed. How did you get into Smaug's lair without alerting Smaug to your presence? Or getting burned to a crisp, he thought, but did not say. Bilbo tensed, laughing nervously. I've become quite the burglar. Sneaking around without being seen has become a special gift of mine. His hand dipped into his pocket subconsciously. Legolas could tell his friend was hiding something, but did not push him. It would be unfair if he demanded to know all of the hobbit's secrets when he kept so many of his own. I'll leave you to your mission, he said. Good luck, Bilbo. I'm going to be around the camp, so if you need help, just call. I'm curious to meet the man who slayed Smaug. Bilbo smiled, earlier unease forgotten. Thank you, Esgil. I will. The elf vanished into the night, and the hobbit continued on his way. He no longer trekked nervously towards the encampment. He was no longer afraid of attack. His assassin friend had his back now, and Bilbo knew he would not come to harm when Esgil was watching. Bard the bowman was sure he was dying. His throat was drier than the desert, and his head pounded as if a blacksmith were hammering it. His skin felt hot and sticky, and his vision blurred, nausea overcoming him every few steps. He ached from the center of his bones, and if he did not know better, he would say that he was ill. This was more terrible and draining than any illness he had ever experienced or heard of. Ever since he had slain Smaug, Bard had been feeling steadily worse. At first, small tremors and sudden chills had been all he had experienced. Then, suddenly, he was blacking out, and his body hurt more than an old man's. At first, the healers had thought it was shock. Then they began murmuring about a dark curse cast by the dragon. But Bard knew better. He had been warned not to use the black arrow. The nervous, jumpy merchant that had given it to him, he had been almost desperate to be rid of it, had told him to not use it unless he needed to kill something that could not be killed. His statement had made no sense until Smaug had attacked Lake Town. Then, the arrow's use had been obvious. Bard had shot the dragon, a thing that could not be killed by normal weapons, with the black arrow. Now he knew why the merchant had been so adamant. The curse upon him was not from Smaug. It was from the arrow. Bard had felt it. As he had drawn back and released the black arrow, he had felt its anger, as clear as a sentence in his mind. You are not meant to wield me, it had hissed. But he had anyway. He had released the arrow, and it snarled in rage, even as it struck Smaug's heart. And instead of feeling proud and joyful as his people cheered around him, Bard felt hollow and afraid. He became slowly, terribly ill soon after. It was not an illness of coughing and the rejection of sustenance, but a slow weakening and deterioration of his very soul. The closest thing he could compare it to was an elf fading from grief. Yet here he was, participating in a bloodless siege on Erebor, waiting until a war over gold began. Normally, he would be quite adamant about receiving his share of the gold as a reward for killing Smaug, but his illness was a more pressing burden on his mind. It did not stop him from demanding a 12th of Erebor's treasure, but the need to receive said treasure was steadily decreasing. Bard walked slowly through the encampment of elves and men, eyes closing every few seconds as if he were about to fall asleep on his feet. Most likely, if the bowman did give in to the tempting darkness of unconsciousness, he would collapse in the street. And that would not do well for the men's morale or his own personal image. So Bard struggled on, trying to think of a reason why the master of Lake Town wanted him to come to his tent. Something must have come up, but he could not think of what. "Are you all right?" a musical voice asked him. Bard blinked slowly, and suddenly a cloaked figure was in front of him. The bowman was too tired to flinch. He stared at the figure dazedly for a moment, taking him in. He was dressed like a ranger, with a brownish-green cloak, and carried his weapons openly. Bard took in the bow and knives, and even in his almost delusional state, the man knew they were elvish. The figure was most likely an elf then, because few men would be able to get their hands on elvish weapons. Either that, or the bowman was hallucinating, and no one was standing in front of him because not a single passerby was giving them a second glance. "Are you all right?" the elf repeated worriedly, and Bard realized he had been quiet for too long. The man forced his dry lips to move, and hated how his voice rasped. "I'm fine." "You do not sound or look fine," the elf said flatly. "What ails you? Perhaps I can help." Bard slowly processed this. He had not thought to ask the elves for help with the curse. Then again, had they ever encountered a weapon like the black arrow before? Would they even be able to help him? It was worth a try, he supposed. He could not feel much worse off. Then again, a feeling of utter hopelessness took him, and a terrible despair rose in his heart, so great he almost choked. The image of the black arrow burned in his mind, and he swore that it was still hissing at him. "I don't think I can be helped, Master Elf," he said softly. The elf was silent for a moment before he spoke. "That depends, Master Human. My name is Esgol, by the way." "I am Bard, the bowman," the man introduced slowly. His vision swam, and he closed his eyes, nausea and chills washing over him. The elf's eyes, what odd violet eyes, brightened with recognition. "You are the man that slayed Smaug?" he asked. Bard nodded warily. "Yes, I—" He swayed, and Esgol caught him, gripping his shoulder. "I'm taking you to the healers," the elf said quickly, guiding him through the crowd. "They can't help me," Bard rasped, black spots dancing in front of his eyes. "No one can." He could barely keep his own feet, chills and flashes of heat rushing through his body. His head felt like it was being split open. A shudder shook Bard's frame, and he squeezed his eyes shut. An anguished tear made its way down his cheek. Without fully comprehending what he was speaking, the bowman began to mumble to himself, ignoring Esgol as the other took him towards the healing tent. "I should not have used it. He warned me not to unless the situation was dire. The dragon's attack was dire. This is not worth it. I shouldn't have used it." "Used what?" Esgol asked softly. He glanced around as if trying to find something. Unknown to the bowman, The elf was trying to figure out where the healer's tent was. It did not help that the people around them assumed Bard was drunk, and as such were only walking by without the intention of helping the man. The man blinked rapidly at Esgol, face covered in a sheen of sweat. The black arrow! I shouldn't have used it. It told me I wasn't meant to wield it, and now it is punishing me. Esgol only stared at him in concern, watching with horror as shadows seemed to cover the man, as if they were suffocating him. His skin gained an even unhealthier tinge, and his hands trembled. Bard continued to mumble to himself, seeming to not notice the elf. But I had to use it. We had nothing else that could kill a dragon. I just used it to protect the town. The elf did not know what to do. He could literally see the man in front of him fading, his light extinguishing against the darkness that crept into his soul. How could none of the other elves notice? Why were they not helping him? The hidden assassin bit his lip, struggling to think of some way to help the man in front of him. He noticed that Bard was looking directly at him, eyes both glazed and lucid, and realized the man wanted him to respond. I am glad that you were able to save your people, Esgol said at last, in a soft voice. The black arrow served you well. Smaug is dead, and many of your people survived. Despite the consequences, it is good that you used the black arrow. And suddenly, shockingly, Bard felt better. The nausea vanished, as did the aching and exhaustion. The chills and fever disappeared, and a lightness seemed to wash over him. The labored pounding of the man's heart became a calm, healthy beat, and the pressure crushing his skull ceased. The bowman could feel his strength returning, and the aching in his joints was gone, like it had never existed. The man shrugged out of the elf's supportive hold, standing on his own 2 feet, without feeling like the earth was buckling beneath him. A mildly confused light appeared in Esgol's eyes, as the color rapidly returned to the man's cheeks. Bard smiled, and his face was bright, as if a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Thank you, the bowman said reverently, not fully understanding what had happened, but instinctively realizing the elf had something to do with it. Esgol blinked. For what? Before Bard could respond, a sprinting messenger ran into him, making the man stagger. When the bowman looked up, Esgol had vanished. Where did he... Sorry, sir, the human messenger apologized, eyes wild. I was not watching where I was going. It is all right, Bard said calmly. I'm fine. What news do you bring that is so urgent that you race through camp like a horde of orcs is on your tail? The messenger winced. I have an important message to give to the master of Lake Town and the Elven King. An army of orcs and wargs are headed this way. I have already informed the dwarves, and they are willing to ally with us to help defeat our common enemy, and keep them from gaining the gold inside Erebor. Bard stared at the man mutely, before grimacing. So that is how it is going to play out. It looks like we're going to have to fight after all. Legolas had been in many battles, but he had never participated in one of such size. The 5 armies, 3 of good, 2 of evil, clashed near the lonely mountain. Battle cries in Khosdol, Sindarin, Westron, and Blackspeech rang through the air, and the shouts and screams of the dying pounded on the elf's ears. Everything was a mix of organized chaos, the armies jumbled together in a deadly yet purposeful melee. The elves, men, and dwarves were far outnumbered, but fought on against wave after wave of orcs and wargs. Side by side, the free people fought, adapting to and helping each other. It was amazing. Just a few hours before, They had been ready to fight each other until no one was left standing. Now their orders were simple: survive, and kill as many orcs and wargs as possible. The enemy had similar intentions, though their only goal was to slaughter all of the dwarves, elves, and men they encountered. Even with 3 armies on their side, the enemies vastly outnumbered the free people. That did not stop the smaller side from fighting, however. Legolas left a trail of dead enemies in his wake, using all his skills to kill as many orcs and wargs as he could, as quickly as possible. While the warriors around him blocked and exchanged blows, he killed. Legolas stabbed an orc on his left and beheaded another, diving beneath an orc's blade to leap up and stab the creature through the head. A quick forward thrust with his left blade ended a warg, and a kick to an orc's kneecap sent him crashing to the ground. Legolas jabbed his knives down, pulling them free. He turned, leaned, and let a blade pass, striking the orc's shield hard and making the creature's arm go numb. Legolas grabbed the shield, slamming it up into the orc's head. The orc fell in a heap, skull caved in. A warg sneaking up behind him lunged, and he turned, forced to block as the warg's jaws snapped at him. The elf kicked the warg in the muzzle, making it howl in pain. He lunged and stabbed it once in the jaw, up into its brain. He rolled out of the path of another warg, drawing his bow, aiming, releasing. The arrow hit the back of the warg's knee, and it went down, its rider flying over its head and hitting the ground. The elf dashed over to the warg, ending its existence with a single stab. Legolas scanned the battlefield, caught in a small lull. He spotted a golden-haired elf locking blades with an orc nearby, and tensed as the other did not notice the warg sneaking up on him. Knives were sheathed, and his bow drawn in a second. The warg jumped at the unsuspecting elf. The assassin fired, and his arrow hit the warg's side, startling it enough that it missed the elf. The warg snarled, struggling to its feet. The golden-haired elf flinched and turned, finding himself inches from sharp teeth. The warg growled, jaws opening. Its body jerked and it slumped to the ground, revealing an arrow in the base of its skull. The other elf looked up, and blue eyes met hidden violet. The sounds of the battle seemed to fade, and all Legolas could see was the other elf's face. Deep within himself, the assassin felt something. For a moment he could not place it, but then he realized what that feeling was. It was recognition. He knew the other elf. Memories struggled to reach the surface of his mind, but remained hidden, trapped and unable to be recalled. Still, Legolas felt a connection with the other elf. He knew him, somehow. He was important. The other elf, the elf with familiar golden hair and blue eyes, was... Legolas could not remember. Mere feet away, Thranduil felt the same unexplainable feeling that his hidden son did. He was confused, struggling to recognize the one who had saved him. His presence did not feel familiar, not at all. So why did he feel a connection to this man? The other was cloaked and hooded with the Elven King unable to see his eyes, but he had to be a man, right? He was too tall to be a dwarf, and did not glow like an elf. The Elven King did not recognize him as one of his warriors anyway. So why did Thranduil feel like he should know him? After what seemed like an eternity, but was only a minuscule moment of time, the sounds of battle returned to the 2 elves' ears. Thranduil blinked and focused, too much of a warrior to ignore the fight any longer. He nodded at the man that had saved him and returned to the battle, pushing all thoughts of the strange connection he had felt with the other out of his mind. There was no time to ponder what he felt. not now in the middle of war. Thranduil vanished in the chaos. Legolas felt a sharp pang of loss as the other elf left, an unexplainable feeling of grief, sadness, and hurt rising within him. He pushed the feeling away before he too focused on the battle once more. He slashed a warg down its side, cutting it open, then stabbed an orc in the gut. He spun, blades sweeping in an arc, and slicing 3 other enemies, then ran forward and leapt, landing on the back of a warg behind its rider. He stabbed the orc before severing the warg's spine, jumping clear as the creature screamed and collapsed to the ground. Like a serpent striking, his blades flicked out, sinking into another. His daggers caught in the orc's chainmail, the metal twisting around his blades, making them stick. An orc, sighting his trapped weapons, charged at him. Legolas released his knives and rose to meet the creature. He dodged the swipe, jabbing a pressure point in the orc's arm to make it release its sword. Before the sword hit the ground, the elf grabbed the orc's head and turned it sharply to the side with all his strength. Crack! With a harsh snapping sound, the orc's neck broke. The assassin let the body fall to the ground, retrieving his knives. Once again, he scanned the battle, searching for allies that needed assistance. He recognized Thorin fighting close by, with his nephews not far away from their uncle. They were surrounded by orcs, but doing well, keeping the enemies back and hacking through them with the skill of great warriors. But none of them saw what the elf could see. An orc archer was standing not far from the 3 dwarves, a circle of his kin around him. An arrow was drawn back in his bow, which was pointed directly at Thorin. "Look out!" Legolas shouted, running at the dwarves. Thorin turned, eyes widening as the arrow sped towards him. The assassin hit his side, knocking him down and out of the arrow's path. Instantly, the elf was on his feet, shooting the archer that had tried to take the king's life. The elf turned, and Thorin found himself looking into piercing violet eyes. "Are you unharmed?" Legolas asked in his musical voice. Internally, Thorin reeled in shock. Until the other had spoken, he had thought his savior had been a man. But that was not the case. He had been saved by an elf. He could not believe it. "Yes," the dwarf said shortly, showing none of his stunned thoughts on his face. He scowled at the next wave of incoming enemies as another band of orcs and wargs charged towards them. "Kill the dwarf king," one orc screeched, sword held aloft. "Kill the line of Durin, and you will be rewarded." The orcs and wargs responded with bellows and roars of their own, surrounding the 4. Instinctively, the 3 dwarves and 1 elf made a square, watching each other's backs as the orcs and wargs closed in. Legolas quickly adjusted his fighting style, careful to block and redirect blows instead of dodging them. He had allies behind him now and could not let the enemy's attacks swing by him. The dwarves and elf stabbed at enemies that came close, a shield of deadly blades protecting them from and felling their foes. It was like they had fought together all of their lives, each noting and making sure to complement each other's fighting styles, covering their mistakes and working together like one mind. When Thorin slayed the closest orc, Legolas killed the next closest one. When Kili drew his bow and shot arrows into the masses, Thorin and Fili kept their enemies away from him. When Fili misjudged a swing and stumbled, Kili and Legolas kept the orcs and wargs back while he recovered. Piles of corpses surrounded the 4 warriors, and by their blades many of their enemies fell. But their allies were also dying, and Legolas could not help but scream and rage internally as he saw a man lose his head, an elf fall to a spear, and a dwarf get mauled by a warg. The orcs and wargs kept coming, not tiring, confident in the strength of their numbers, and that they would eventually win and decimate the smaller forces that stood against them. Kili said what the elf was thinking. There's still so many. Thorin gritted his teeth, speaking harshly but encouragingly to his nephews. Keep fighting, for Erebor. The surrounding elves, men, and dwarves took up the cry, adding their own. For Erebor, for Lake Town, for Dale, for Mirkwood, for Middle-earth. Once more the three armies rallied, attacking the ocean of orcs and wargs with all of the determination and valor of their races. If they were going to die, they would go out fighting, and take down as many of the enemy as they could before they passed on. At that moment, a loud, earth-shattering roar ripped through the air, making the defenders flinch and cringe. It was a horrible, fear-inspiring sound, and both allies and enemies found themselves trembling beneath its might. Expecting a new, terrible attack made by the enemy, the elves, men, and dwarves turned towards the noise. To their surprise and awe, a giant bear was wading through the orcs and wargs, roaring as he decimated their ranks. Before a cheer could rise from the free people, a new shout sounded through the air, carrying easily over the bear's roars. The eagles are coming. And the eagles appeared, swooping down on the orcs and wargs. Legolas looked at Thorin and saw the dwarf looking at him with a relieved smile on his face. And although the king under the mountain could not see it, Legolas smiled back. The eagles and bear had turned the tide. The orcs and wargs no longer held the advantage. It was practically over. They had done it. The battle of the Five Armies was won. Even after years of being unoccupied, except for a dragon, Erebor was still magnificent and beautiful. Now that the threats of smog, siege, and battle were gone, Bilbo took the time to marvel at the craftsmanship of the dwarves. He was in the throne room of the city, standing before a dwarf who mere days ago cast him out and called him a traitor. Thorin sat upon the throne of his forebears, back straight and head held high. He no longer wore the garb of a warrior, but the elegant robes and cloak of the king under the mountain. Kili and Fili stood at the sides of his throne, cleaned up and more well-dressed than Bilbo had ever seen them. Bilbo's eyes met the youngest dwarf's for a moment, and Kili grinned, winking cheerily at him. Thorin's coronation and the brothers' formal acceptance of the titles Crown Prince and Prince had been a couple days before, and the future of Erebor was looking up. The orc and warg threat, along with the battle that followed, had knocked sense into Thorin, and he began peaceful talks with those he had slighted. The dwarf king gave Thranduil, Bard, and the men of Lake Town the gold they asked for, and justly deserved. Treaties, agreements, and alliances had been forged between the three races, the hope for a prosperous future and a united stand against the shadow, bringing them together for the first time in thousands of years. Bilbo did not know what had caused Thorin to let go of his anger and hatred of elves, but a good change had come over the king. Now, Bilbo stood before the king and his nephews, the other dwarves that had participated in the quest standing beside him. "Bilbo Baggins," Thorin said, "again and again I judged you harshly, and thought you were not worthy of being a part of the quest. But again and again you proved how wrong I was." Thorin rose, walking forward to stand in front of the hobbit. He placed a hand on Bilbo's shoulder. "I apologize for my treatment of you, and wish to inform you that I am proud to have fought at your side. I hope that my lapse in sanity can be forgiven, and that we can be friends once more." "Our friendship was never severed," Bilbo said with a smile. Thorin returned the grin, eyes bright with joy few had ever seen. Even with the shadows still growing and darkening this land, the future is looking bright. His expression changed, and Bilbo swore he saw a hint of mischief in the serious king's eyes. Now that that is over with, there's someone I would like you all to meet. Hello, Bilbo, a familiar voice said in the hobbit's ear. Gah! Bilbo shrieked, and all of the dwarves except Thorin, Fili, and Kili jumped. Will you stop that? No, Esgil said simply. In response to the glare he got, the assassin grinned. His hood was down, revealing his facial features, light blonde hair and pointed ears. What is an elf doing here? Glórin demanded, hand drifting towards his weapon. Esgil saved my life in the battle of the Five Armies. He pushed me out of the way of an arrow and fought at my nephew's and my sides for its remainder of the battle. He is a friend, Thorin said firmly. His sharp gaze landed on Bilbo, and his lips twitched. I assume you already know Esgil. Yes, Bilbo said shortly. He takes pleasure in taking years off my lifespan by giving me heart attacks. I can see why, Glóin grumbled. Make some noise, would you, elf? Esgil shrugged. Asking me to make noise while moving is like asking a dwarf to sleep in a tree. It is most likely not going to happen. A few of the dwarves tried to picture one of their kind in a tree and snorted, chuckling at the ridiculous image. A dwarf? In a tree? Like that would ever happen. Bilbo looked at the elf, surprised by the calmness in which he spoke to the dwarves. He knew Esgil had trouble trusting others, and the fact that he had revealed himself to so many people stunned the hobbit. But other than the small hint of tension in his shoulders, the assassin did not look nervous or wary in the slightest. Bilbo's eyes drifted back to Thorin, and his shock only grew as the king under the mountain laughed with the others. And though he stood close to the elf, the dwarf's stance held no animosity or anger. It was then that realization clicked in Bilbo's mind, and he understood Esgil's reasoning. Esgil was the reason Thorin was willing to trust and make the alliance with the elves. However, many of the other dwarves, most in positions of power or influence in Erebor, still carried mistrust and prejudice. Esgil was revealing himself now to show the dwarves that elves were people too, and could be friendly, strong allies. It was one thing to see an elf while negotiating a treaty or fighting a battle, but another to see them laughing, smiling, and at ease with old friends. Exposure to Esgil had knocked Bilbo's childish, godlike vision of elves out of his head, and would hopefully help these dwarves see that they were not stuffy, distant, cold immortals that cared only for their own race. Bilbo felt a swell of pride for his friend, knowing how hard it must be to show himself like this. The elf was hiding it well, but the hobbit, a good friend of his, could see his nervousness. You really are a good person, Esgil. You think you are only good at killing, but you do so much more than that. You care enough about strengthening relations between elves and dwarves to show yourself and try to make them understand the other race a little better. Ha! The elves have no idea how much you do for them, and you don't either. Thorin sobered, looking solemnly at the elf. Once again, I thank you for saving my life. Anyone would have, the elf said seriously. Perhaps, Thorin said, but it was because you fought directly aside dwarves that I believed an alliance between our races was possible. He offered his arm, and Esgil clasped it. You have my sincere thanks for saving my life from orcs and saving me from myself. From now on, and until our races go their separate ways, you will always be welcome in Erebor.